So good afternoon, everyone. I wanted to welcome you to another outstanding Authors at Google talk. Now, one thing I wanted you to keep in mind while I give my intro is I wanted you to specifically pay attention to any time I reference the University of Illinois, YouTube, or the word Indeed. We are indeed very pleased to be joined today by a Nobel Prize winner, Chris Chabris, for today's talk. I take that back. He's actually an Ig Nobel Prize winner, which is pretty much the same thing, except the speeches are shorter and the talks are a little bit more meaningful. Along with his colleague Dan Simons, Chris has created a landmark video, which I'm sure many of you have seen. It is called The Invisible Gorilla, and he'll probably talk about that at length today during our conversation. And it's went viral on YouTube. Many of you have probably seen it. I remember when I saw it for my first time viewing. I'm actually a graduate of the University of Illinois in Champaign, and so Dan works there, and I thought for certain that the elevator in the movie was our elevator in the psychology building. So I was paying attention to that for the entire program. I missed everything else, and it turns out the elevator was at Harvard, so I was clearly mistaken. But I didn't get to see the bonus feature. Now, Chris received his PhD from Harvard, and now he is an assistant professor of psychology at Union College. His research focuses on cognitive illusions and perception, and also group behavior and groupthink. And he's published papers on everything from beauty to the Mozart effect to the beauty of the Mozart effect. He'll be speaking us today about his latest book, which is entitled The Invisible Gorilla. It speaks about how perception affects the gorillas in our midst. Indeed, truth is all around us if we're only there to see it. Be sure, as the talk goes forward, to count any instances of passes, both aerial and bounce passes. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Chris to Google. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm glad you got in that Ig part of the Ig Nobel Prize. I have students who sometimes write to me and say, I'd be very honored to work with a Nobel Prize winner on research. And I usually don't write back and explain that they made a mistake. I just let them keep on believing that. So I'd like to start today by showing you a famous experiment in selective looking. And this is not perhaps the experiment you're thinking of. This is actually an experiment done by Ulrich Neisser, one of the pioneers of cognitive psychology in the 1970s. And this is the experiment that inspired Dan Simons and I to do the invisible gorilla experiment that many of you know about and that we'll talk about shortly. What Neisser did in the 1970s was create a video showing 6 people passing 2 basketballs around. 3 people are dressed in white and 3 people are dressed in black. And your task is to focus on the people dressed in white and count the number of times they pass the ball, and to do this counting silently in your head. And at the end of the video, you'll be asked a question about it. Okay, so can I have a volunteer? Oh, come on, don't be shy. I'm going to start cold calling if I don't get any volunteers. 24, okay, volunteer even knew the question I was going to ask. Okay, 24 passes. Now, raise your hand if you notice something else besides the people throwing the ball around. What did you notice? Excuse me? The lady with an umbrella, right. So in Neisser's original study, a woman carrying an umbrella walks through during the passing of the basketballs. But if you notice this, if you look at this video carefully, you don't even have to look very carefully, you can see that it's kind of unusual. For one thing, everyone's a ghost in this video. And the way Neisser created this was using a technique with mirrors to record several videos and then project them together and make a video where everyone overlaps at once. This experiment had been known somewhat in the psychology community, but I personally was not aware of it. Dan knew about it. Dan Simons knew about it when he and I met at Harvard University in the late 1990s. And there was a little bit of suspicion that maybe the reason why people don't notice this woman walking across the screen is that everyone's a ghost, and she's actually a little bit hard to see. And there's strange things. People are walking through each other and so on. Does it really demonstrate something important? How fragile is that ability to notice these unexpected objects? Unexpected events. So Dan and I were teaching a course in research methods to the undergraduates at Harvard. In this course, each student was supposed to produce their own experiment and collect data and write it up at the end of the term. But Dan had a great idea, which was, why don't we make it more fun for everybody and have one experiment that we can all work on together as well. Now, there aren't that many psychology experiments which require 10 or 12 people, but Dan knew about Neisser's experiment and decided we should film it and recreate it in the psychology department, but with a few twists. So one of those twists was going to be that we would do it live with everybody moving around in between, in and out, and so on, so that if we still found that people didn't notice something unexpected, it wouldn't be because everybody was a ghost. The other twist was to try some things other than a woman carrying an umbrella. Maybe a woman carrying an umbrella is kind of hard to see because it's not that surprising and it's not that unexpected. What about something else? Well, one of the other professors in the department had a gorilla suit lying around in his lab. Someone always has a gorilla suit lying around, right? So we borrowed that, that's borrowed, and had one of our students put the gorilla suit on and walk across in the video. And we wound up producing a video that looks somewhat like this next one. Now here again, even if you know about this already, I'd like you to really try it for yourself and try hard to focus on the people wearing white shirts and ignore the people wearing black shirts and count the number of times the white-shirted people pass the ball. And once again, I'll ask you at the end how many you counted. Here we go. Okay, so what's the count on that one? 16. Okay, most people got 16? All right. Raise your hand if you noticed a gorilla walking across the screen. Okay, did anyone not notice the gorilla? Okay, raise your hand if you noticed anything else unusual. Okay, I only see like 3 hands up in the whole room. So you, sir, what did you notice? The curtains changed from red to yellow. So raise your hand if you noticed that the curtain changed from red to yellow. I mean, you can see that it's yellow now. Okay, so I only see about 2 hands. Did anyone notice anything else unusual? You, sir. One of the people in the black shirts left. That's correct. Did anyone else notice that one of the people in the black shirts left? Okay, nobody. So I fooled you. You thought there was going to be a gorilla, and you opened your mind to the possibility that the gorilla might appear. You were able to sort of prime yourself to notice a gorilla, but that didn't mean that you were going to notice all the unexpected things that happened. There were 2 other unexpected things that happened. This is a video that was created by Dan Simons this year. He calls it the monkey business illusion. And the idea is that expecting the unexpected, or knowing that your attention is limited and you might not notice things, doesn't necessarily enable you to notice all the unexpected things that are going on around you. If you had known in advance that something might change color, you might have picked up on the curtain, but then you might not have noticed the gorilla. So there's sort of no, the trick to this is deeper than just something you don't notice. In psychology jargon, this phenomenon is known as inattentional blindness now, and this is a term that was popularized by Arian Mack and Irvin Rock in their book of the same name. And the idea is that when we're not paying attention to something, it can be as though we're actually blind to it. It's as though the thing isn't there, or as though we don't see it at all. It's not as though we sort of catch a faint glimpse of it, but not a really good perception of it. When people are told afterwards that there was a gorilla walking across in our original video that they didn't see, they don't suddenly say, oh yeah, there was a gorilla, but I just forgot to mention it to you. Instead, they say, no way, there was no gorilla there. Or in the original experiment where we had videotapes, they said, well, show me the tape again, and we would rewind it and play it again, and they'd say, well, but that wasn't there in the first place. Maybe you switched the tapes on me, or used some kind of sleight of hand or something like that. On the other hand, people who see the gorilla, or probably the people who saw the color change or the person walk away this time, think it's very clear and obvious, and they are surprised that other people missed it. So as we thought about this experiment more and more, we realized that it wasn't just telling us something about inattentional blindness. It wasn't just a dramatic demonstration of inattentional blindness. And incidentally, just to illustrate how dramatic a demonstration this is, other researchers later ran this experiment using an eye tracking device, which records exactly where subjects are looking at all times, and found that some subjects who missed the gorilla in the original video had actually looked right at it for up to a full second and still missed it. So it's not just that their eyes happen to be pointing the wrong way. There's actually some kind of cognitive blindness to this thing. And that's really interesting, but the more we thought about it, the more we thought there was something even more surprising about it, and that was, in fact, the surprise that people have about the results of this experiment. It really conflicts with some deep belief we have about how our minds work. Something about our experience tells us that we really should be noticing all the important things that happen, especially if they're right in front of our eyes and they last for a full 9 seconds like our original gorilla thumping event did. And this belief that we're noticing and paying attention to much more of the world around us than we really are is what we've called the illusion of attention. The illusion is that we're noticing and paying attention to far more than we actually are. Now, we call this an illusion sort of deliberately. It's in some ways by analogy to visual illusion. So this is a famous visual illusion. Look at these 2 tables and raise your hand if you think the table on the left is longer than the table on the right. Okay, so I'm going to raise my hand too, because to me, the one on the left definitely looks longer than the one on the right. Now, if I had a nice, clever animation, I could rotate that table on the left and overlay it on the table on the right, and you would see that they are the exact same dimensions in all respects. And it is a pure illusion that the one on the left looks long and narrow and the one on the right looks wide. It has to do with perspective and the way our perceptual system actually wants to experience a three-dimensional world as opposed to something projected on a two-dimensional screen. But no amount of knowing what I just told you is going to make it look any different. It still looks longer. It's an illusion. It's built into the way our perceptual systems work. And we would argue that illusions like the illusion of attention are built into the way we think about our own minds. I see someone there sort of going like this and trying to imagine it. If I had a stick up there, I could prove it to you. I could sort of stretch a stick out and then move it around. That's what I do when I teach this to students. Trust me on this one. It's really built into sort of the structure of how we understand our own minds. I see someone is still doing it. They still don't believe me. Trust me, please. I'm up here giving a talk. You're supposed to trust me. So this illusion of attention, the more we thought about it, we realized was actually an example of a more general phenomenon about the mind. And we call this the idea of everyday illusions. So I'm going to get a couple of definitions out on the screen now for what I'm going to be talking about for the rest of the time today. Everyday illusions are intuitive, common sense beliefs that we all have about how our own minds work that are systematically wrong, not easy to overcome, and can get us into big trouble if we aren't aware of them. Now, one way the illusion of attention can get us into big trouble is the way that it causes us to talk on our cell phones while we're driving. The illusion causes us to talk on our cell phones while we're driving because it convinces us that we're able to see and notice everything we need to do while we're driving just as well when we're talking on a phone as when we're not talking on a phone. The illusion of attention tells us that because we have this rich perceptual experience, we see the road in front of us. It's not like we're looking someplace else to talk on the phone. We see the road in front of us. We're getting the same visual input hitting our retinas and going into our visual systems and so on, that we must be noticing and perceiving all the important stuff out there. And that's actually not true. When you're talking on the cell phone, you're depleting a central resource of attention that actually applies to all perceptual modalities and to thinking in general, not just vision. So talking on the phone, even though that's an auditory language task, decreases your ability to notice unexpected things. And it's noticing unexpected things, which is really what keeps you out of most accidents on the road. You know, when someone cuts you off, or when someone goes into the walkway, or when you're in somebody's blind spot, and so on. If we didn't have this illusion, if we really understood how limited our perceptual and attention systems would be, we probably wouldn't do things like talk on cell phones. And of course, incidentally, by the way, it's not holding the phone that's the problem. It's not the number of hands you have driving, it's the amount of your mind you have paying attention to the task of driving. So hands-free phones don't really solve the problem either. Now notice that I said that these illusions are intuitive beliefs. So by intuition, I mean a kind of rapid thinking that we aren't even aware we're doing most of the time. Intuition is what we're using when we make a quick judgment or decision without thinking about it, which is to say that intuition comprises most of the thinking we do in our lives. Now, I realize that there are other definitions of intuition. Some people think of intuition as some kind of spiritual phenomenon where you just sort of come into contact with the truth or something like that through some ineffable process. That's not really what I'm talking about. I'm talking about rapid thinking and decisions made without reflection. So when we pick up the cell phone and talk while we're driving, we're doing that because of an intuition that tells us that we're not driving any worse. We haven't really stopped to analyze the problem very carefully or think about research on attention and so on. We just go with it. We don't feel like we're driving any worse when we're talking on the phone. So those are everyday illusions. And in our book, we talk about 6 everyday illusions. I'm going to talk about the rest of them for the rest of this talk. And as well as that, I'm going to talk about intuition a little bit. Here's another example of an everyday illusion. This one is called the illusion of memory. The illusion of memory is the idea that our memories are more complete, detailed, accurate, permanent, and objective than they really are. Those qualities, detail, accuracy, permanence, objectivity, and completeness, are qualities that we sort of act as though our memories have in much greater abundance than they really do. Now, of course, you may say, yeah, I don't remember what I had for breakfast 3 weeks ago. I'm not talking about that kind of memory failure. I'm talking about something much larger than that. For example, you're going to see now a video of an experiment done by Dan Simons, my co-author of the book, and his colleague Dan Levin when they were grad students at Cornell. This is an experiment where an experimenter would approach a pedestrian on a courtyard, on a quad. So here is the subject in this experiment, and here's the experiment. And the experimenter simply without telling him anything about the fact that he's in an experiment, says, please give me directions to the gym. And there's not going to be any audio here, but it doesn't matter. You can see what happens next. So as he's giving directions, two other people carrying a door have rudely cut between the experimenter and the subject, and one of the people carrying the door switched places with the original experimenter. Now the guy left talking to the subject is Dan Simons himself, and you'll see shortly that the subject actually, having looked earlier directly at the first experimenter, now looks directly at Dan for quite a while as he's completing his instructions. And Dan now says, oh, by the way, you were just a subject in a psychology experiment. Let me explain to you what's going on. Did you notice that I'm a different person than the one you were talking about earlier? And surprisingly, in this experiment, the response of about half of the participants is, no, I have no idea that you're a different person. Some people notice it, some people don't. And it's not just, this is an older gentleman, but it's not a function of how old you are. Likewise, the ability to notice the gorilla is not a function of how old or young you are, or how well educated you are, or whether you're intelligent or stupid, or what your personality type is. As far as we've been able to tell, and other researchers have been able to tell, these things are built-in features that are universal to the human mind. Now, we haven't gone to all the countries of the world and tested these things out, but as far as we can tell, at least within our country and other places where this has been studied, it's not some kind of special personality trait or some kind of reflection on the strength of your mental abilities. It's a general property of the human mind. In this case, the phenomenon is known as change blindness. So we can be blind to significant changes in our visual world if our attention is not called to those changes while they're happening. So if right now I blinked out of existence and was instantly replaced by a different person, you guys would all notice, but that's only because you would have seen the change. If something distracted you, like a big billboard came in front and I was replaced by someone else, maybe someone else who was also a male about 40 years old or something like that, you might not notice the difference. Probably most of you would, but some of you might not. It's a surprising finding. You can't change a man into a woman, it turns out, or a woman into a man in this way and have people miss that. You typically can't change much older people into much younger people, or change, say, a construction worker into a policeman, or a professor, into a mailman or something like that. But that's about it. What's going on here? Well, our memories, it seems, are encoding much less detail about the world around us, or if they're encoding it, they're dumping it very quickly and not maintaining it for very long, and that's not the way we think our memories work. So this is the illusion of memory, the idea that our memories are more complete and permanent and accurate than they really are. If you turn it around and think about it a little bit, why would we have this illusion of memory? Or put another way, why would our memory systems be so limited? Some people say, well, is that a defect? Like, how come we don't save all that information? And I could turn it around and say, well, why would you want to save all that information? Your brain would get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, accumulating all those details all your life. And if you built a big brain in order to be able to do that, you'd never get out of your mother during the process of being born. There's a severe constraint on the size of the brain, and you just can't go on adding functions willy-nilly to it, or else the species won't continue on. And perhaps remembering all the details we think we're remembering is not really a very useful mental function to have. Maybe remembering the kind of person we're talking to and whether they're male or female and simple categories is most of what we really need. Okay, so let me show you one more example of this change blindness phenomenon. I'm going to show you this example for two reasons. One, there's a Google employee pictured in it. I don't think he's here today, though. And two, when we wanted to do more studies of this kind, when Dan came to Harvard, this initial study was done at Cornell. When Dan came to Harvard and he started working with me, we wanted to do more of this kind of thing, but the Human Subjects Review Committee at Harvard had a somewhat different view of this than at Cornell, and they said, well, you really can't just go up to people on the street and start experimenting with them without getting their consent. And we said things like, well, but, people get approached for directions all the time in Harvard Square. What's the big deal? This kind of thing happens to people all the time. And they said, well, no, you really ought to get consent first. So we come up with a different experimental setting that enables us to get consent. And here's an illustration of it from a program that the BBC did several years ago. I've turned off the sound, so you won't be hearing the narration, but I'll narrate it a little bit. Now, what you're going to see is first you're going to see the two people in the subject. We changed one of them into the other. You might recognize the first guy, if any of you know him here. Notice they're wearing different color shirts, and they have different faces, different hairstyles. We set up a booth, set up a counter in the psychology building, and put an experiment here sign and recruited subjects in the basement and said in the lobby and said, why don't you go up and participate in an experiment? When they came up out of the elevator and they approached the counter, they saw the first guy standing behind it. And he said, here, fill out this consent form first, and then the experiment will begin. This is Dan, by the way, explaining this. So they would fill out the consent form. Sometimes they would read it, but usually they would just sign it, hand it back, and now this would happen. The first guy would duck down, and the second guy would come up and hand them a form and say, go down to that room, go down the hall to that room, and you'll meet someone there who will tell you about the rest of the experiment. Now, crucially, what the consent form had said was, in this study, you're going to be exposed to an event, and you'll be asked questions about it. But it didn't say when you're going to be exposed to the event. So as soon as they hand that consent form back with their signature, the event starts right then. And they're early in that point not in the mindset of, I've got to be on guard, the psychologists are going to trick me now. The rest of this video will just show more examples of this. So in this case, once again, a significant percentage of people, when asked, a few seconds later, well, did you notice that the guy who came back up from behind the counter was a different guy than the one who went down? They said, no, I had no idea. And one of the ones you may see here if I let the video run on long enough was an undergraduate at Harvard. Oh, here she is. This is Elizabeth Kensinger, who's now a very excellent, important professor at BU studying memory. And she did not notice the change. It turns out being a professor who studies memory does not really enable you to notice all these changes in the world around you. We have a story in the book about how a friend of ours told at a party that Dan and I were both at an entire story that happened to me and not to him, but pretending as though it was his own story, and he had completely forgotten the source of that memory and thought he had experienced himself the joy of sitting down next to Patrick Stewart at dinner. That happened to me, not to him, and he studies false memory, incidentally. The video continues with more and more of this. So I've shown you two examples of everyday illusions that can have a significant effect on how we perceive and understand the world in our daily lives. I think there are a lot of sort of deeper applications of this kind of thing beyond just these visual examples we've shown you. Inattentional blindness or the illusion of attention can apply to sort of information in general and the information that we think we're paying attention to and using when we make decisions. Change blindness and the illusion of memory can apply in many different circumstances. I mean, for one thing, I'm not really here to provide advice on how to live your life, but if you start fighting with your husband or wife or boyfriend or girlfriend or whoever about whose memory for what happened a month ago is exactly right and whose is wrong, you should just stop, because the chances are high that neither of you remembers exactly what was said a month ago, and you're wasting your time and just getting mad at each other without ever coming to any resolution. On the other hand, if you're clever, you might consult your sent mail folder or your saved messages folder or your calendar, because it turns out nowadays we do leave a lot of electronic trails that can help us reconstruct the past that we didn't have before. And you guys may know of even better tools to reconstruct what you've been doing, your browser history and so on. So sometimes you can use that to figure out what's going on. Okay, so enough of this. It goes on and on with more people. Some of them actually notice. I think this person actually notices what's going on. Yeah, so some people do notice. By the way, I don't know if you noticed, but Dan's wearing a different shirt than he was at the beginning of this video. Once again, trust me on that one. Okay, so now I've showed you some of these illusions, and now I'm going to switch gears to something different. As Monty Python used to say, now for something completely different. Going to take a little bit of a detour now into a poetry reading. It'll be very short. How do I love thee? Let me count the ways. You might recognize this. This is one of the most famous lines in all of English language poetry. It's by Elizabeth Barrett Browning from her work Sonnets from the Portuguese. I believe this was sonnet number 43 out of 44. And of course it goes on to enumerate various different ways. Now, Elizabeth Barrett Browning wrote these lines and the rest of it during her courtship with Robert Browning. And there they are. This is Elizabeth, and that's Robert. They make a really fine couple, I think, especially by the standards of the 1850s. Remarkably modern hairstyles. Now, this book, even though it came out in 1850, already by the late 19th century, it was very prized and recognized as an important work. In 1885, a British book dealer and collector named Thomas J. Wise, pictured here, was offered for sale by another collector that he ran into, a privately printed edition of the Sonnets from the Portuguese that the Brownings had printed, or that Elizabeth Barrett Browning had printed a few years earlier, before the actual first known printing in the 1850 book. And he paid £10 for this and got some of his collector friends to also buy copies. And he actually snapped up several copies and started then selling them to other dealers and collectors and libraries and other institutions around the world. And after that, he began discovering other similar works. For example, something by Tennyson. This volume, this is actually the volume that Wise discovered from 1887, and this was, once again, a privately printed edition of something that came out later in the first known edition. So what Wise was discovering was all these sort of items which sort of fit pretty well into the body of an author's known work. It wasn't a completely new work, but it was a new edition. And he sold these around the world to collectors, libraries, universities, and so on. And did this for many decades. It became known as Great Britain's best bibliographer and book collector later in his life. Unfortunately, for Wise, in the 1930s, two younger British book dealers conducted an investigation of some of these pamphlets and discovered, through a variety of techniques, that many of them were fraudulent. That is, Wise had printed them up himself along with some conspirators and was passing them off as originals. The techniques these dealers used to discover the fraud were of the deductive logic variety. So, for example, on this one, right here, they noticed that these ornaments that were used to decorate the cover had actually not been designed until about 15 years after the date on the cover of the pamphlet. In the case of the sonnets from the Portuguese, they put the paper under a microscope and detected that it was made of wood pulp. And they knew that wood pulp was not actually used to make paper in Great Britain until the 1870s, so it could not have been printed in that form in the 1840s. And they also identified numerous other ways that the printings were inconsistent with everything else that was known fact about how books were made at the time and these authors' works and so on. They published their indictment in a very long book explaining, without really coming right out and saying it, that Wise had committed a fraud. Now, why did I tell you this whole long story? Well, here's a case where scientific analysis and logical deduction really proved that Wise had been committing forgery for quite a long period of time. He denied it, of course, but everyone believes that he did. This story of detecting forgeries using scientific analysis, and the contrast between that and sort of the intuitive decisions that were made by all the collectors and dealers and libraries who saw this stuff and said, well, this book looks good, this looks like it makes sense, superficially it looks like something we should add to our collection. This may remind you of a story that you've heard about if you read Malcolm Gladwell's book, Blink, which is subtitled The Power of Thinking Without Thinking. Now, in Gladwell's book, he begins by telling the story of an ancient Greek statue known as a kouros. And here's the... this is an example of what I'm going to tell you is the myth of intuition. Here's the statue. Now, this statue was discovered, and it was in the possession of a collector from Switzerland who offered to sell it to the Getty Museum in Los Angeles for $10 million. And the Getty Museum commissioned some scientific tests which suggested that the marble the statue was made of was in fact from ancient Greece, from the proper time period and place, as it would have been if this were an authentic statue. So the Getty forked over the $10 million. And then later they had some other collectors and other art historians and art experts look at the statue. And as Gladwell recounts in his book, they said things like, well, I hope you didn't pay for this yet. Or they said they felt a revulsion, or it left them feeling cold, or it just didn't look right. So they could tell by looking at it that there was something wrong with it, that the scientific analysis of the material in the statue couldn't tell. And Gladwell presents this as sort of the triumph of intuition. They were able to intuitively, within a second or two, know that this was wrong, know that it was a forgery, whereas the scientific experts had not been able to prove that, and in fact were convinced otherwise. Gladwell uses this to open his case in this book for sort of the power of intuition, or as he calls it, rapid cognition. Now, incidentally, the Getty Museum and various experts are not yet in full consensus about whether this statue is a forgery. For example, the caption in their own catalog says, about 530 BC or modern forgery. So it's not completely agreed yet that this is a forgery. But even if it is, what are we to make of these two contrasting examples? One in which intuition detected a fraud that scientific analysis didn't, and the one that I presented of Thomas J. Wise, where intuitive thinking wound up acquiring and spending a lot of money on these things for collections that turned out to be wasted money, and only really careful logical deduction and scientific analysis proved him to be a forger. I think actually that the Thomas J. Wise case is probably much more representative of the relationship between intuition and logical analysis in the case of art forgeries. I will bet you that many forgers go to their graves having fooled everyone and never get detected. Usually it's sort of intuitive thinking that accepts these things as accurate, and only scientific analysis or some kind of logical analysis that proves them wrong. For example, the Hitler diaries were accepted as genuine and made public in Germany until it turned out that the paper they were written on was made after World War II. So they could only have been authentic if Hitler was, down there in Brazil, like writing them out or something like that after World War II was over and sending them back. Now, what we call the myth of intuition is this idea that intuition has special powers as a mode of thinking to figure things out that rational analysis and other forms of thinking cannot do. At this point, now, statues, even a $10 million statue, well, it's just statues. What's the big deal, if people think this way? It's fast, it's efficient, doesn't cause too much damage except to museums and art collectors, and they're not really all that sympathetic. Who are the real victims here? Well, at this point, this is where this man comes into our story. In case you don't recognize him, this is Bernard Madoff, the biggest and most famous Ponzi schemer in world financial history. Now, what does Bernard Madoff have to do with the myth of intuition? Well, one thing that's not realized often about Madoff is the real story of why he was not caught before he wound up engaging in $50 billion worth of fraud and looting lots of institutions and individuals out of all of their funds. The Inspector General of the Securities and Exchange Commission did an exhaustive report on this and documented the fact that the SEC had investigated Madoff many times over the years because they had received tips from people. They had their suspicions that something was wrong. And here he explains why they did not actually catch Madoff. This is a quote from the Inspector General of the SEC. He wrote, "In one of the examinations that the SEC conducted, they asked Madoff how he was able to achieve these returns. Madoff's returns were extraordinary and always consistent. He never had a down period, no matter how bad the market. And they asked him, how are you able to do this? Bernie Madoff said to them that he had a gut feel of how to time the market. They asked him, what is the basis for his gut feel? And he said it was his observations of the trading room. He said he could actually sit on the trading room floor and feel the market and know exactly when to buy and exactly when to sell. And Madoff always bought at the right price and always sold at the right price day after day, year after year. Inexplicably, the SEC just accepted these answers and went on." Now, I think the most important word in this whole passage is one that he didn't underline, and that's the word inexplicably. This behavior is only inexplicable if you forget about the fact that people actually believe that it is possible to use one's intuition or gut feels to time the market and make all kinds of other significant decisions in ways that rational analysis or logic or other kinds of methods thinking can't match. So it's only inexplicable if you don't realize that that myth is out there and that we think about intuition that way a lot of the time. Now, this raises sort of another question. Well, how was, what else contributed to Bernie Madoff's success? I think it's interesting, and it sort of plays into one of our other illusions. The whistleblower in the Madoff case, Harry Markopolos, wrote extensively about this, and he provides some interesting quotes to sort of explain what was going on in people's minds when they encountered Bernard Madoff. Well, Simona Sue, who was an investigator in the SEC's New York office, said that Madoff, quote, didn't fit the profile of a Ponzi schemer in the world that we knew then. Now, what did she mean by this? Well, as Markopolos tells us, there's a reason why Madoff was able to pull off the largest financial crime in history. Madoff was so smooth, so convincing, that even an experienced journalist like Mike Okrant, who had uncovered other Ponzi schemes, came away from that interview doubting what he knew to be true. So Okrant had actually investigated Madoff, determined that he was a Ponzi schemer, and went to confront him with this information and get his side of the story. And at the end of the interview, he wasn't even sure anymore himself. Okrant himself, who was the editor of an industry publication for hedge funds, said, quote, he never complained and he was responsive to every question. He did it without hesitation. There wasn't even a hint of guilt or shame or remorse. So sometimes the way criminals are able to pull off their crimes is by exploiting what we call in the book the illusion of confidence. Interestingly, the word con man has the same root as confidence. The illusion of confidence has two aspects. One of them is that we tend to interpret another person's confidence, their smoothness, their quick answers, their Their strong presentation is an indication of honesty, accuracy, truthfulness, skill, competence, good memory, whatever it is they're trying to convince us of. The more confident they are, the more we believe them. Now, it's, of course, perhaps true that people who are right should be more confident, but we overinterpret that connection. We take it for more than it actually is. Now, this is our third everyday illusion after attention and memory. Now we're at the illusion of confidence. Madoff is a little bit unusual as a criminal. And he's kind of like the James Bond, master villain, like in his secret hideout, with all the fancy gadgets and so on. This time it was at the top of a skyscraper in New York, not on some Caribbean island. But he's really not typical of criminals. Most criminals are not as good as Madoff. They don't get away with $50 billion schemes for that long. Most criminals are actually fairly incompetent. So now, to illustrate this point, I would like to ask the person who received an envelope from me earlier to please stand up now. I handed out an envelope earlier to someone. Okay. So can you open that envelope and show us what's inside? What is that?
I'm assuming a fake bill for $1 million.
It's a $1 million bill, correct? Okay, so what's your name, by the way? Jessica. Okay, so Jessica, what do you think would happen if you went out to the supermarket and tried to use that $1 million bill to pay for your next batch of groceries?
They'd probably laugh at me.
They would probably laugh at you, and they probably wouldn't cash it for you, right? Okay. So Jessica is much smarter, it turns out, than this man, a man who flew into a rage at the Giant Eagle supermarket when employees refused to cash a $1 million bill. This was an Associated Press story from Pittsburgh. Now, it's kind of interesting that a guy went into the supermarket and tried to cash a $1 million bill. What's more interesting is that he flew into a rage when they refused to do this, suggesting that perhaps he thought that they should or they would negotiate his $1 million bill. I also wonder where he got the $1 million bill, but in any case, maybe it was handed out at a talk he went to. What this illustrates is a mismatch between this guy's assessment of his own abilities and his actual ability. He thinks he's better at crime than he really is if he thinks he can get away with this. According to Inspector Gareth Woods of the Cheshire Police, there are some pretty stupid criminals around, but to leave your own name at the scene of the crime takes the biscuit. Now, the crime was graffiti, and it was committed by someone named Peter Addison, who wrote, "Peter Addison was here" on a wall. Another stupid criminal. And then finally, this man, Lieutenant Terry Hastings, said, "I just don't know why he didn't see a uniformed police officer standing basically right in front of him. My guess is he's just not the brightest of people." Now, what he's referring to is this gentleman right here who attempted to rob a bank where there was a police officer sitting in the lobby of the bank the entire time. If you can find this video online, by the way, it's actually very funny. The police officer tries to arrest him, but he resists, and they wind up wrestling in the bank and running around the bank, chasing each other for quite a while. It's very entertaining surveillance camera footage. The guy had come into the bank and cased it for a couple of minutes before he actually went up to the teller and tried to rob it, and that whole time the video shows the guy sitting right there behind the desk, sort of waiting to catch him. Now, Lieutenant Terry Hastings is suffering a little bit from the illusion of attention, because as we've all seen, it is possible to walk around someplace and not notice something important that's happening in front of you. That's the illusion of attention. Nonetheless, all these examples illustrate criminals who seem to think that they're better at crime than they really are. Now, this illustrates the second aspect of the illusion of confidence, which is that we tend to overrate our own abilities in various areas. We're overconfident in our own skills. Let me try a little test on you to see how overconfident you are in your own skills. I have a question that I adapted from a study by Justin Kruger and David Dunning, two very clever social psychologists. For each one of you, I'd like you to think, what % of Google employees have a worse sense of humor than your own? Now, I know you're all here at my talk, so you're probably some of the funnier people here, but try to be honest with yourself and think about what percentage of Google employees have a worse sense of humor than your own. And just get a number in your head, what that percentage might be. And now that you've got that percentage, let's test your own sense of humor and see how funny you really are. I'm going to give you two jokes, and I'd like you to tell me which one is funnier. Here's joke one. Question: what is as big as a man but weighs nothing? Answer: his shadow. Joke two. I heard someone laugh. Joke two. If a kid asks where rain comes from, I think a cute thing to tell him is God is crying. And if he asks why God is crying, another cute thing to tell him is probably because of something you did. Now, by actual laughter, it seems like most of you think joke 2 is funnier than joke 1. And you should pat yourselves on the back because, in fact, when Kruger and Dunning presented these two jokes, as well as a number of other jokes, to a panel of professional comedians, the professional comedians rated joke 2 as the funniest out of the entire group and joke 1 as the least funny out of the entire group. And by using these ratings by professional comedians and then giving all these same jokes to students in their experiment, they were able to figure out how well student ratings of funniness of jokes agreed with professional comedian ratings of funniness of jokes. And they used those correspondences between the students and the comedians as a more or less objective measure of how good the student's sense of humor was. Now, of course, it's really how well their sense of humor matches that of a professional comedian, but a professional comedian is paid to understand what's funny and to implement that in their own act. So it's not really as bad a test as you might think. So they compared how funny people actually were with how funny they thought they were. And here's what they found. The straight diagonal line just indicates the actual test score on this humor test. So those who were in the bottom quartile, by definition, scored 12.5% in this test, and those who were in the second quartile, by definition, 37.5%, and so on, if you just divided them into quartiles. But notice that the perceived ability, that is, what percentage of people who they thought were less funny than they were, is actually above 50 for all of these groups. And the largest difference between perceived funniness and actual funniness is found in those who are the least funny. So this was dubbed by Kruger and Dunning the unskilled and unaware of it phenomenon, that those who are least skilled at something are least aware of their actual skill level or exhibit the greatest discrepancy between how good they think they are and how good they really are. Now, yeah, of course, once again, it's just like the statues before and so on. This is sense of humor, and sense of humor, maybe it's not that important, although I do have to say it is right up there in all the personal ads. You always see sense of humor, on all the dating sites and so on is number one. And incidentally, I just heard of some recent research that is not published yet, so I don't want to talk about it too much, but someone said that sense of humor is actually one of the best predictors of how good you are in bed, it turns out. So it's really more important than we think sometimes. Nonetheless, it is a little bit fanciful. What about something more serious and more important, and especially something more objective, where instead of using these kind of tests, we really know how good people are? Are people still overconfident in their own abilities when they have all the information they need to truly know how good they are? Well, Dan Simons and I, along with Dan Benjamin, who is now an economics professor at Cornell, a few years ago did a study to look at this. We went to the environment of competitive chess, and we visited chess tournaments like this one. Now, chess is an interesting arena to study because chess has an objective statistical rating system that tells you, in essence, exactly how good you are. It will tell you exactly what your probability is of beating anyone else based on their rating, and the ratings are frequently updated. Players all know their own ratings, and most of them have a pretty good idea how the ratings are actually calculated. So we went to this chess tournament and asked them two simple questions of the players. One, what's your current chess rating? And two, what should your rating be to accurately reflect your skill? So we got two numbers from them, and we simply subtracted them. And it turns out that, on average, players think they are significantly underrated, meaning they think their rating should be higher to reflect their true skill. In fact, they think they are so underrated that their true self should beat their rated self by a score of 2-1 in a match, which is a really significant difference. They think they are significantly underrated. And moreover, those at the lower end of the rating scale, the worst chess players, think they are more underrated than those at the top end of the scale. So unskilled but unaware of it is not just an artifact of something where we don't have a good idea how good we are. It's something that applies even when we have objective information about our own skills. It really shows that the illusion of confidence is sort of part of our self-assessment across the board and is kind of resistant to data in many ways. Now, that was the illusion of confidence. Let me move on to a related illusion, which can be illustrated best by an experiment by the British psychologist Rebecca Lawson. Again, very simple. No high-tech experiments here today. Rebecca Lawson asked subjects, how well do you understand how a bicycle works? Asked them to rate on a scale of 0 to 7, how well they understand how a bicycle works. 0 meaning I have no idea, 7 meaning I'm really very knowledgeable about how bicycles work. And then she surprised them with the following question. Draw a bicycle, being sure to show the frame, pedals, and chain. You might think for a second about how well you could do this task. It's also fun to transpose the whole situation to a toilet. How well do you understand how a toilet works, and now draw the mechanism of a toilet? Now, you guys, there are probably a lot of engineers in the audience and so on, so you guys are probably a bad audience for this thing, and you would do better than the subjects in Lawson's study. Here's some of what they produced. These are examples from Lawson's actual paper. Now, I hear a lot of laughter in the audience. Perhaps that is because you have noticed that in all 4 cases, the chain connects the 2 wheels to each other. Also, this is one of my favorites here. The pedals are suspended kind of like a hammock between the 2, in the frame. I don't see how you can possibly power the chain to turn the wheels with that pedal. At any rate, ironically, drawing C was actually the most experienced bicycle rider of these 4, and yet she has the chains connected. She rode an average of once per day. And what this shows us is that just riding a bicycle doesn't really necessarily give us a good idea of its workings. Just seeing it every day doesn't really tell us that much of permanence, it seems. It really sticks in our minds that we can express in an abstract way. Probably if you set these people down in front of a bicycle, they would have a much better idea of how the mechanism works. But they gave pretty high ratings to the answer to her question on a 0 to 7 scale. So their intuitive idea about how much they knew didn't match the reality of how much knowledge they could actually produce and use. Now, an analogy for you guys that I think is very relevant here, now, thanks in part to your work, we all have access to tremendous amounts of information, like literally instantaneously. I mean, I see now I don't even have to finish my query before all the information comes back at me, I get it after the first 3 letters. Well, that can create a powerful sense that I have more knowledge than I really do. Because I can access it so easily, it's in the world around me, it's at every computer around me now. So one consequence of that is that I skipped ahead a little bit, is that we may sort of get an overestimate of our own knowledge because knowledge that's really out in the world, like in the bicycle or in the toilet or on the internet somewhere, we sort of think is in our own heads because it's easy to access from outside of us. Now, if you thought bicycles, which are really pretty simple, were hard, what about this? Now, I don't know if you're familiar with this particular image. I'll read it to you. It says Abacus 2007 AC1, $2 billion synthetic CDO referencing a static RMBS portfolio selected by ACA Management LLC, and it has the Goldman Sachs logo up in the corner. This is the famous collateralized debt obligation that the SEC sued Goldman Sachs over earlier this year and wound up settling the case for, I believe, $550 million payment. It was very abstract, complex financial instruments like this that were in some ways at the heart of the financial crisis of recent years. And the difficulty people had understanding these, or the belief they had that they understood them much better than they did, may have contributed to the difficulties that we all suffered. Retrospectively, there was some great reporting on the financial crisis that suggested that really people did not understand these things as well as they thought they did. For example, Vincent Daniel, at Front Point Partners, a hedge fund, told Michael Lewis that when talking to CDO salespeople, you figure out if they even know what they're talking about, and a lot of times they don't. And there's a lot of other testimony that people who bought and sold and traded these instruments didn't really understand them as well as they thought they did, and as a result did not understand the risks and bought too much of this stuff, which in turn led to too much of it being created and so on. These are examples of what we call the illusion of knowledge, the idea that our knowledge and understanding of the world is deeper and more complete than it really is. Oftentimes when you sort of scratch the surface of our knowledge, it turns out that we have familiarity with something. We know some terminology and jargon, but we don't really have deep understanding. Okay, I'm going to skip the next slide and go straight to our 5th illusion, which is the illusion of cause. And this is the idea that we understand cause and effect better than we do. John Cassidy, writing in the New Yorker, says, "It is inarguable that Geithner's stabilization plan has proved more effective than many observers expected, this one included." Now note what he says, it's inarguable that something that the government did in 2009 has proved effective. Now what's the evidence we have, really, that something the government does is effective or has any particular effect at all? Well, we know what the conditions were in 2009, and we know what they are today, to the extent we can measure them in each case, what the financial conditions are, and we know that they're different and better now than they were in 2009. But that provides no proof that any one particular action taken in 2009, no matter how well-intentioned or carefully designed, was actually the cause of the change. Of course, we don't know if things would have gotten better without that action, or maybe they would have gotten worse without that action, or maybe they would have gotten even more better without that action, or maybe what he did really was effective. We just don't know. But we assume that when something is done at time 1, and then there's a change at time 2, that what was done at time 1 was the cause. And this is the way we reason causally throughout our lives. We think that things that happen in sequence happen because of cause and effect. Often that kind of reasoning is purely an illusion. And I can't really explain this any better, really, than to show you this example. This really makes the point better than I possibly can, so I'm going to turn the talk over to The Simpsons. Okay, so if I were writing an article about this, I could say, well, it's inarguable that the institution of the Bear Patrol prevented bears from invading the town of Springfield. But all I know is that after the Bear Patrol was started, there were no more bears, and that after I started carrying around that rock, there were no more tigers, and so on. This may seem almost laughable now that I describe it to you, and oftentimes when you see these illusions in action, they sort of seem at once obvious and trivial, but once again, when you think about this affects huge amounts of our decision making. Now, we can't always run a randomized experiment to test the effect of every different kind of policy we'd want to do, but we shouldn't sort of just be stalemated and stymied and not try anything, but we should just realize what the true strength of our evidence and our reasons for our beliefs actually is, and a lot of times it's lower than we think, and we act as though we're much more certain of cause and effect than we really are. Now, let me mention our final everyday illusion, which is the illusion of potential. As was mentioned in the introduction, I've studied the Mozart effect. The Mozart effect is the idea that if you listen to Mozart's music for 10 minutes or so before you take a test, like an IQ test or an SAT, you'll do better than you would have if you just sat in silence or listened to something else, like heavy metal or whatever. And this was based on a study that came out in 1993 in the journal Nature. And as soon as that study came out, well, the seed music companies rushed in to produce a Mozart Makes You Smarter, Train Your Brain with Mozart, Baby Mozart. The Baby Einstein company, which many of you may be familiar with, especially if you're parents, was founded around the same time to sort of take advantage of the notion that this kind of exposure to music and other works of genius could really have a powerful effect on our minds. Now, it turns out they don't. I looked at this later, and it turns out almost no other labs were able to replicate these initial Mozart effect findings. They found pretty much nothing. If there was a small effect of listening to Mozart before you did something, it was probably because it put you in a better mood than just sitting alone silently for 10 minutes did. And when you're in a better mood, you wind up doing a little bit better on tests and other things you have to do. Nothing really all that shocking about Mozart. The illusion of potential is the belief we all have that it's very easy to unlock our reserves of brain power and mental ability and skill. Now, we're not saying we don't have reserves of brain power and mental ability and skill that we can unlock. It's just not that easy. You have to do things like study and practice and get educated and so on. That is how we increase our skills, not just by listening to music for 10 minutes or playing video games that are going to sort of reverse our brain age and make our minds younger and so on. What typically happens when you do that is you get better at the games, but you don't get much better at anything else. So if it's fun for you, go ahead and do it. Just don't believe that it's making your IQ any higher. Now I want to end, I sort of want to sum up some of what I've been talking about today by talking about a self-help phenomenon known as the secret. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this idea, but as the cover of the DVD informs us, the secret has traveled through centuries to reach us. The secret is something, according to the people who've written these books, namely in particular Rhonda Byrne, an Australian TV producer, the secret is the law of attraction. It's another way of stating the power of positive thinking. If you think positive thoughts, positive things will come to you. But if you think negative thoughts, negative things will come to you. And it really is that simple. It really works that way, according to them. If you think about your bills and get worried about the bills that you're having trouble paying, you're going to get more bills and you're going to have more trouble paying them. But if you think about getting checks in the mail or funds deposited in your bank account, it'll happen. I mean, it really is that simple. You laugh, but it really is that simple. That's an example that comes right out of these books. These books are on the bestseller list, millions of copies sold, and so on. Why do people believe this stuff? Well, it turns out, I think, that these books are really sort of masterfully exploiting many of the illusions we've talked about today and other facts about how the mind works. And notice that traveling through centuries, these ideas have been around for centuries, in fact. And one of the reasons why these ideas have succeeded so well is that they really take advantage of some of the holes in our rationality that are illustrated by these illusions. Now, the real secret to this secret is based mostly on something called illusory correlation. So how many of you had this experience? You're thinking about someone you haven't seen for years, and then suddenly the phone rings, and there they are. You get a message from them. Or, well, I don't know if this is happening to you guys nowadays. You have good jobs already, but you went for a job interview, and you're thinking about, boy, I'd really like to get that job offer, and then a few hours later, the job offer comes. And you notice enough of these coincidences in your life, you might think that you actually had, caused them with your own thoughts. And I think that's what happens to people that believe in these ideas. They notice what's called an illusory correlation. They think about the times when two things happen together, and they don't think about all the times that they weren't thinking about their friend, but then their friend called, or the times when you were thinking about your friend, but he didn't call, or the times, quote unquote, where you weren't thinking about your friend and he didn't call, which is pretty much all of your life. People don't factor all that stuff into their calculations of how unusual these events really are. If they did, they would see that, well, inevitably, sometimes two things are going to go together. It's just by chance. The illusion of potential is also involved here. Wouldn't it be great if we all did have the potential to massively change our lives just by thinking positive thoughts? The illusion of knowledge, there's all kinds of sort of physics, quantum mechanics, mumbo jumbo that's sort of thrown at us to explain this stuff, and that can sort of create the illusion that we understand these ideas better than we do. And then social proof and the argument from authority, they really deploy sort of like experts to tell us that these things are right and show how many people have believed this, including supposedly Jesus and various important historical figures. The idea of the secret and the power, these two books, is really that they perfectly exploit everyday illusions to convince people to believe things for which there's zero real evidence. Now, why did I bring all this stuff up? Well, these illusions have important consequences. They're a lot beyond this. They're not just sort of trivial, interesting facts about how our minds work. They really affect our everyday behavior, and that's why we call them everyday illusions. We're thinking according to these illusions a lot of the time, and if we could become aware of them, we might be able to make better decisions in a lot of different areas of our lives. Now, I want to sum up with one final message, and I'd like to refer back to Woody Allen's famous stand-up comedy routine from the 1960s, and he used to conclude by saying, "Well, I wish I had an affirmative message to leave you with, but I don't. So would you settle for two negative messages?" Now, I realize that some of these messages that I've been trying to send you may seem a little bit negative. You know, our minds are limited. We don't pay attention to as much as we think we do. We don't notice as much. We don't remember as much. We pay attention to confidence more than we should. We don't have incredible powers and so on. Boy, what a downer this guy is. Well, first of all, I didn't build the mind this way. I'm just telling you, how it actually is. So don't blame me for that. But two, I think it's much better to live in the world if you actually know all that stuff than if you don't. You can waste incredible amounts of effort thinking positive thoughts when you could actually be doing something instead to get what you want. You can waste, you could do a lot of bad things if you follow these illusions too much, and you can do a lot of better things and make better decisions if you're aware of them. So that's my final message is, think about these things a little bit and start to notice how they affect your own behavior and your own lives. And thank you very much.
Now we have some time for a few brief questions if anyone wants to use the Q&A mic and ask a question.
So the most remarkable thing about the bike drawings to me was not that everyone has such a messed up idea about how bikes work, but everyone drew the exact same handlebars.
You're very observant. Actually, what she did in the experiment was she drew in the handlebars and the seat and so on and asked them to add the frame and the chain at the bottom part of the frame and the chain and the pedals. So she sort of put the easy parts in and asked people to fill in the difficult ones. So that's why those top parts all look the same. I think you'd get similar results if you asked people to draw, from scratch.
Right.
So.
But the simplicity of the initial drawing probably influenced what people drew later, right?
Oh, you mean you think because it sort of started out as a sort of like simple-looking line drawing that maybe made them do it worse than they would have otherwise?
Right. I mean, were they actually told to draw as accurate as possible, like technically?
Oh, well, I don't think they were told to sort of like make a mechanical drawing, sort of version of it. I don't think they necessarily had that skill. But I don't think that really actually matters all that much because no matter how, little drawing skill you have, you should still be able to not connect the chain to both wheels, right? I mean, that's kind of like a functional error more than a drawing or an artistic error, right? But yeah, you did definitely notice that it wasn't exactly the way I described. I kind of simplified it a little bit. Who's next?
You want to come up?
Okay, how about the guy at the mic first?
Okay. So yeah, going back to the bicycle experiment, you sort of in an offhand way, you said that perhaps that the fact that people have access to more information than they used to have means that, we think that we have more information internally than we actually do. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if you explore that more in the book, or if you could just elaborate more on that. If you see, like, is there any study where, people don't have access to libraries or computers, or, say, like, you talk to people who ride their bicycle every day versus somebody who doesn't ride a bicycle if you could just talk some more about that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I did kind of sort of throw that in as like an offhand observation, and the reason why I did was that we haven't actually done any studies on this. I think it would be really interesting to do some cognitive psychology research on what's the measurable effect of having more or less access to information about a particular topic. How does that affect how well you think you understand it, and so on. And I can't really tell you what the results would be because we haven't actually done that yet. So it's more of a hypothesis than a settled conclusion. And I don't mean to say, by the way, that having access to more information, heaven forbid, in this building, that to say that having access to more information is a bad thing. I think it's undoubtedly overall an extremely great thing, but there may be some side effects on our perception of how much we actually understand. I base this partly sort of on my observation of students sometimes, that it's easy for students in courses to think they understand things a lot better than they really do. And I think part of the reason for that is that the information is so accessible. Not only is there textbook, but they can look things up on Wikipedia. And now we put our PowerPoint slides online. They go to lectures and so on. The information comes at them in a lot of different forms a lot of the time. But I don't think it necessarily helps them understand how well they understand the topic. They still sort of say after they did badly on the test, well, how did I do so badly on the test? I really looked at all that information and so on. But I definitely agree that this is a very fruitful area for more experiments that I would like to work on.
But so you seem to be suggesting that you think that somehow easier access to information is making people conflate, I don't know, like
what's in their head with what's out in the world.
Or maybe in that last example, like facts with some, I don't know, deep understanding or...
Yeah, essentially, yes. That the easier it is to access information, the harder it is to tell the difference between information that we actually know and information that we can easily retrieve. That's the hypothesis. And you look skeptical, so which I think is good, because it definitely hasn't been tested extensively. But I think it's an interesting hypothesis for investigation.
Thank you.
Thanks. There was someone over here, or maybe he's back over here now. Oh, okay. Yeah.
I just had a question about that $1 million bill example there. I've seen videos of, I don't know how real these videos are. They're from some mentalist guy. But he pays for things with white paper that's roughly in the shape of dollar bills. And I was just, is that the same thing?
I haven't seen the videos you're talking about, but I suspect what's going on there is that, if you distract the people, in certain ways from what you're doing, they may just sort of take what you hand them and stick them in the cash register or something like that. Now, of course, if this guy wanted to buy a milkshake with $1 million bill, he probably could have got away with it. It was the expecting change that was the problem. And in order to get your change from $1 million bill, the cashier's got to look at it and see that it's $1 million bill and, and so on. So I don't think it's exactly the same. But in a way, a lot of what mentalists do and magicians, of course, is manipulate your attention. So they manipulate what you're paying attention to and what you're thinking about at any particular time. It's very easy with all the stuff that we can miss in the world to imagine we could miss actually looking at what we're stuffing in the cash register or something like that. Thanks.
So in the experiments that you did, you mentioned that there were some people who were perceptive, who noticed that experimenters had changed or whatever. I was wondering if there was anything else about these people. Were they happier? Were they sadder? Were they miserable? Had they had 3 divorces? I don't know. Anything that you might have come up with.
Well, we didn't test a 3-divorce hypothesis. That might correlate with the happiness or sadness. In general, the answer is that nothing has been found that at all strongly predicts whether people notice unexpected things in intentional blindness experiments or notice changes in change blindness experiments. Things you think might, like sort of their working memory capacity, how much stuff can they maintain in memory at one time, doesn't seem to. Dan Simons has been doing some research on this. I even, by the way, ran a study where we included the gorilla test along with a lot of other tests, and then we got DNA from the subjects and looked to see if there were any genes that the gorilla noticers had that the missers did, and we didn't find anything. But of course, it's very hard to find genes for things like that, so that was a little bit quixotic. But Dan has found maybe some sort of faint hints that personality variables might affect it, but they're extremely small effects and hard to see. So that your success or failure at noticing something is a really bad personality test, a really bad measure of anything. And I think most of it is circumstance and luck and whatever's happened, whatever's going on in your brain at that time and so on. There's I hesitate to just call it random because there's sort of nothing truly random, but from our point of view, it would be random.
I have another question about the $1 million bill experiment. So you use that as an example, or at least the way I interpret it, you used it as an example of somebody whose perception of their skill at deceiving was far off from their actual skill, and they...
Or for his skill at crime, yeah.
Yeah. But isn't it possible, I guess the way I interpreted it when I saw that was that maybe he used his anger at not receiving change as an additional projection of confidence that it was valid and that he should be receiving money back?
Well, that's certainly possible, and sometimes when I get angry at a customer service person, it helps a little bit.
Right.
Yeah, that's a possible explanation, and I like that you called it the $1 million bill experiment, because we didn't actually do an experiment with $1 million bills. It would be interesting. It would be interesting to do that. You've given me an idea. Just now, so we'll have to include you as a co-author if we do a $1 million bill experiment. I think there may be something to what you're saying, and I have to say, in honesty, I used it in part for the humor value. But you can easily find lists of all these kind of like stupid, Google stupid crimes, and you'll get a lot of them. And I can't help but think that one thing that's going on in these cases is that the criminals think they're better at crime than they really are. Now there are probably other things happening too, like where did this guy get the $1 million bill, and how did he think he came into it without paying for it with $1 million or something like that. So there's obviously more to the story. And maybe you're right about that he was just trying to really like wow them with even more confidence.
Yeah, I don't know.
Could be.
Thinking about it.
Hi. Interesting talk. I loved it.
Thank you.
You mentioned the distinction between what we know in the head and what we can infer from the environment.
Right.
And these days, more and more of our knowledge or whatever we know is shifted onto things we carry, like cell phones.
Mm-hmm.
Like 10 years ago, if you asked someone to speak out the 5 closest people's phone numbers, they could do that.
Right.
Today, I don't think anyone would be able to cite those numbers.
Right.
So it's all distributed cognition. So do we really need to make a distinction between what's in the head versus what's with me?
Right. So this is an excellent question. What is this boundary between the head and this boundary right here that's made up of bone and and skin and so on? Is that really cognitively significant anymore, as significant as it used to be? And I think the answer is no. To some, it's not completely unimportant. It's not irrelevant, but it's not as important for the reason you say. And maybe we should start to instead of studying the abilities of the individual as much as we do, which is the traditional way in cognitive psychology and cognitive neuroscience, start to study the abilities of the human computer or the human device partnership or the human internet partnership, or of groups of people working together, which increasingly happens in workplaces much more than it used to. And I started doing a little bit of research on that myself, where I did something really trivial. I had people do an IQ test, not an IQ test, sorry, I had them do a GRE, a standardized test, with or without a computer that they had access to, just for fun, to see what would happen, how much smarter do they get when they have a computer. And it turns out, good news, they do better. But maybe not as much better as you might think. And it might differ depending on what kind of materials they are and so on. So I think that's a very faint first step at starting to study exactly the phenomenon you're talking about, and move that into sort of what psychologists study when they study intelligence and human abilities and so on. It's a good suggestion. Oh, the $1 million question was coming, though.
Oh, yeah, if it's really quick.
She gets to ask one because she got the $1 million bill.
Yeah, it's really quick. I was just wondering, in the experiments that you do with people looking for the gorilla or the one with the umbrella or whatever, have you guys ever gone into like biology, neurobiology, to see what parts of the brains actually are stimulated in the people that do see them, and how does that differ?
Well, the answer is, for these kinds of experiments, generally no. We haven't done that, and part of the reason for that is it's a methodological challenge to repeat these experiences enough times that you can get enough data to really answer those questions. Once people know there's a gorilla coming, it's hard to redo the same thing again. There has been research on what goes on in the brain when we pay attention to one thing and ignore other things, but that's not stuff that we've actually done ourselves. Thanks.
Chris, that was an amazing talk. Thank you very much for speaking with us.
Thank you.